In a remote parish surrounded by pine ridges and outdated train lines, St. Cecilia Sanctuary once served as a spiritual cornerstone for isolated farming communities. But between 1932 and 1953, it became associated with a string of unacknowledged disappearances. Officially, no investigation was ever completed. Informally, however, archivists and researchers have pointed to a consistent pattern. 27 ordained personnel assigned to the sanctuary over 2 decades vanished without formal leave or explanation. This story examines the administrative oversights, documentation gaps, and circumstantial decisions that permitted their erasure. St. Cecilia Sanctuary was established in 1889 in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, as a self-sustaining religious institution operating under diocesan oversight. Its role was to manage missionary services, house itinerant clergy, and train seminary candidates. By the early 1930s, it was regarded as a dependable yet unremarkable administrative post where senior clergy were rotated for retreat or archival duties. Public bulletins described it as serene, disciplined, and uneventful. However, its staffing records tell a different story. Over a 21-year span, appointments to St. Cecilia were rarely publicized, and transfers were often backdated. Many personnel were never reassigned. The institution's visible calm concealed a quietly persistent disappearance pattern. Ready to begin Chapter 1, Part 1. At the diocesan headquarters in Harrisburg, rotation paperwork from the early 1930s displayed a steady stream of assignments directed towards St. Cecilia Sanctuary. Unlike urban parishes, which commonly involved multiple correspondences for even minor staffing changes, the communications involving St. Cecilia were brief and procedural. Transfer notices rarely exceeded a single page, and many lacked signatures from the incoming clergy. The diocesan clerical secretary between 1931 and 1940, a laywoman named Irina Mathis, later testified in a retired faculty newsletter that the paperwork involving St. Cecilia always arrived late, usually after the staff had already moved in. No irregularities were ever flagged. The sanctuary's remote location may have contributed to its procedural autonomy. Located nearly 12 miles from the nearest telegraph office and without any paved access road until 1946, St. Cecilia had limited immediate oversight. While diocesan auditors typically performed annual evaluations of all regional institutions, records suggest that only 4 site visits occurred between 1932 and 1953. These were logged by senior officials, whose other duties often included seminarian evaluation, library management, or cathedral budgeting. Travel to Franklin County was described as disruptive and logistically impractical during internal correspondence. Clergy assigned to the sanctuary were generally older, often with prior service in multiple rural parishes. Personnel files from this period indicate that many had previously submitted requests for reassignment to quieter posts due to administrative fatigue, chronic health issues, or unspecified familial obligations. St. Cecilia provided a slower rhythm of responsibilities, which included cataloguing archival materials, conducting Latin seminars, or overseeing estate parcels left to the sanctuary in wills. It was considered an appropriate environment for semi-retired clergy. The sanctuary's primary building, completed in 1892, included private quarters, a chapel, a kitchen wing, and a small infirmary. The structure itself was not outwardly remarkable. Photographs show a gabled slate roof, narrow Gothic windows, and plain white clapboard siding. No ornamental features or towers were ever added. The layout emphasized seclusion. Quarters were arranged along an internal corridor that could be shuttered from the main nave. Most rooms had no telephone access, and letters were dispatched via a bi-weekly courier from the county seat. In 1937, a newly appointed diocesan auditor named Father Harold Latting requested clarification on several backdated staff removals from St. Cecilia's ledger. According to his internal memo, 3 clergy listed as residents had no recorded exit documentation. Parish bulletins from nearby communities, which occasionally included visiting schedules, showed no activity from any of them after mid-1936. The matter was dismissed by the Assistant Chancellor, who wrote in margin notes that such omissions were clerical lapses, No formal corrections were issued. During this same period, a minor seminary in Lancaster reported difficulty obtaining responses to mailed invitations sent to St. Cecilia for regional retreats. When contacted by telephone, the diocesan office acknowledged receiving the complaints, but stated that mail disruptions were not uncommon for sanctuaries outside municipal delivery routes. The complaints were not logged beyond that correspondence. In 1941, diocesan yearbooks ceased listing individual staff names under the St. Cecilia entry. Instead, the notation simply read, "Rotating clergy," as appointed. This formatting change was not announced publicly and remained in place until the sanctuary's closure in 1954. Other sanctuaries maintained full listings during this period. The absence of public reference did not entirely erase internal documentation, however. A privately circulated memo from Bishop Claiborne in 1944 described the sanctuary as functionally stable, administratively self-sufficient. The bishop had never visited the location personally. His assessment was based on second-hand reports from clergy returning from brief visits, most of whom had stayed no more than 2 weeks. These visitors were typically there for spiritual reflection or brief assignment rotations and did not engage with long-term residents. Among the few surviving first-hand accounts from personnel assigned to St. Cecilia is a 1948 letter written by Dr. Malcolm J. Rowe. Addressed to a colleague in Erie, it outlines several logistical frustrations, including poor heating, lack of external contact, and ongoing confusion regarding task assignments. He describes the environment as disjointed in purpose and notes that some staff were not entirely clear on their official roles. He remained at the sanctuary for 6 months. Rowe later served as a document analyst for the diocesan archives and attempted to revisit records of his time at St. Cecilia. According to his notes, several entries he expected to find were missing. The sanctuary itself never submitted formal complaints or deficiency requests to the diocese. Most repair requisitions came indirectly, either through supply vendors or visiting clergy. Invoices from local electricians and masons list frequent work orders between 1945 and 1950, many marked requested verbally by clergy. However, no signatures were attached to these requisitions. These invoices were paid without comment from diocesan budgeting offices. A minor controversy emerged in 1951 when a prospective postulant assigned briefly to St. Cecilia for pre-seminary orientation filed a request to be reassigned after just 11 days. His request was approved without documentation of cause. However, a form letter attached to his file noted that he had expressed difficulties adapting to the sanctuary's operational cadence. The incident was not publicly reported. He did not pursue ordination. By 1952, administrative mentions of St. Cecilia became less frequent. An internal report noted that fewer candidates were being rotated through the sanctuary. It was suggested that the sanctuary's purpose had shifted from formation support to archival storage, although no formal declaration was issued. In March of 1953, a final set of records from St. Cecilia listed 3 active clergy, Dr. Emmett Chaley, Dr. Wallace Bear, and an unnamed deacon. By July of that year, all 3 were removed from the registry without follow-up notations. Unlike previous removals, which were often left without comment, these were crossed out by hand and labeled "vacated by reassignment." No transfer documents have been recovered. The last recorded financial entry from St. Cecilia came in December 1953. It was a maintenance payment to a fuel delivery company in Chambersburg. The receipt was signed by a third party whose name does not match any known personnel records. In April 1954, St. Cecilia Sanctuary was officially closed. The building was sold to a private party, and the property was zoned for agricultural use. No ceremonial closure or public announcement was made. The diocese transferred remaining archival documents to a regional seminary, but the complete personnel ledger was not included. In subsequent diocesan audits from 1955 onward, the sanctuary was referred to only in past tense, with no acknowledgement of previous inconsistencies. Clergy who had served at St. Cecilia and were still active were rarely interviewed about their time there. A majority had retired or relocated by 1960. In 1956, a small group of diocesan archivists began reviewing institutional closures from the previous 5 years as part of a statewide record modernization effort. St. Cecilia Sanctuary was listed among the closures, but contained fewer summary notes than comparable facilities. While most parishes had transition packets detailing building appraisals, staff relocations, and property appurtenance evaluations, St. Cecilia's file consisted only of 2 memos and a folded receipt. During routine indexing, an archivist named Ruth Millet noted that the file lacked any documentation related to the disposition of its chapel items. According to diocesan protocol, every closure required itemized records of sacred vessels, vestments, and liturgical books, all of which were typically redistributed to surrounding parishes. No such inventory existed. Millet submitted a request for supplemental records but received no response. The query was later marked as unverified and filed without resolution. Millet's observation led her to revisit earlier diocesan directories. While she was not tasked with personnel audits, she cross-referenced rotation dates and found 6 clergy listed at St. Cecilia between 1934 and 1951 who had no exit annotations. She brought this to the attention of senior archivist Dominic Hess, who directed her to avoid overlapping with personnel reviews, as those fell under the Chancery's oversight. Millet refrained from formal escalation, but continued to collect copies of pages containing missing data. In 1958, she privately compiled a reference folder titled Anomalous Assignments. It included photocopies of registration forms, housing logs, and chapel bulletins from institutions adjacent to Franklin County. Her notations flagged several discrepancies. Clergy listed as transferred to St. Cecilia often had no known service beyond their initial arrival. In some cases, their personal effects were never forwarded to family or reassigned facilities. Hess eventually requested that Millet archive the folder without further expansion. She complied, but kept a duplicate for personal use. The disappearance of formal inquiry into these irregularities was not unique to St. Cecilia. During this period, many diocesan offices relied on limited staff to maintain records across multiple counties. Oversight gaps were common. Temporary filing systems often used personal shorthand. Memo retention varied based on office space. As a result, potential anomalies were frequently absorbed into broader administrative ambiguity. In 1961, a former custodian who had worked briefly at the sanctuary contacted the diocesan office inquiring about retirement records. He had been hired in 1950 through a referral by a lay brother at a nearby monastery. His employment record was sparse, but confirmed 2 years of part-time residence. In his letter, he described frequent clerical turnover and stated that mail delivery ceased entirely during his final year of employment. He asked whether he was eligible for pension consideration. The office replied that records from St. Cecilia were incomplete and that employment verification could not be confirmed. While this exchange did not trigger an official investigation, it did prompt an internal memo to the diocesan property registrar. The registrar, Thomas Lowe, attempted to verify the custodial work orders. None were located. He noted in his margin annotations that non-clergy staff documentation at Cecilia appears underdeveloped. The note was not expanded. Around this time, Franklin County officials initiated a broader inventory of historic parcels for tax reassessment. The former St. Cecilia property, now owned by a private agricultural trust, was inspected for zoning compliance. A junior assessor, Kelly Donmore, filed a site report that included reference to irregular foundations beneath the main hall. She had been told the building previously housed a seminary extension. The report included sketches of crawlspace accesses and sealed basement entries. The architectural details caught the attention of a historical preservation volunteer, Aaron Flitch, who occasionally reviewed field reports for archival value. Flitch contacted the diocesan office requesting building schematics. His letter was redirected twice before receiving a formal reply stating that no original blueprints were held in active files. He was encouraged to contact the Agricultural Trust for access. No further interaction was documented. In 1964, the diocesan archives were moved from Harrisburg to a newly constructed facility in York. During the move, Millet's anomalous assignments folder was rediscovered and placed in a temporary holding cabinet. A volunteer assistant mistakenly logged it under seminary alumni correspondence. When the error was corrected, its contents were reviewed again by archivist Lila Tanders, who had not previously seen the materials. Tanders noted that several of the clergy in question had birth certificates but no recorded obituaries. She included a recommendation for follow-up, but it was deferred due to staffing constraints. The absence of public death notices or obituary placements raised additional questions. Most clergy deaths, even in retirement, were typically acknowledged in diocesan newsletters. Several local parishes maintained internal memorial ledgers as well. In the case of those linked to St. Cecilia, no such acknowledgements were found. Tanders proposed that either these individuals had left the region unofficially or had not received funeral rites within the diocese. Her memo included a request to cross-reference burial plots associated with clerical pensions. The Pension Office responded that plot records for rural clergy prior to 1955 were incomplete. Many were managed informally or through third-party cemetery boards. Due to a filing backlog, no search was conducted. In 1967, during a public lecture at the Historical Society of Central Pennsylvania, Flitch mentioned St. Cecilia as part of a panel on closed religious sites. He briefly referred to the foundation anomalies described in the 1962 assessment and noted the unusual absence of construction records. His comments drew limited attention, though a graduate student from a local college requested additional citations. Flitch provided a typed summary of his findings, but the student's paper was never published. As more parochial schools and seminaries closed during the late 1960s, interest in the administrative legacy of institutions like St. Cecilia waned. Clergy familiar with the sanctuary had largely retired or relocated. Correspondence from diocesan offices no longer included the site in rotation histories. The property itself was eventually subdivided, with the main building left vacant. By 1971, the former sanctuary's chapel was used for seasonal storage by a local farming collective. Visitors were not permitted. One of the cooperative's founding members, Glenn Forshaw, filed a zoning petition to remove religious designations from the parcel's land title. The request was approved unanimously, and the structure's original use was never cited again in county planning documents. The gradual erosion of institutional memory regarding St. Cecilia was mirrored in adjacent diocesan records. At least 4 parish bulletins from the 1940s that once referenced visiting clergy from the sanctuary were replaced during a microfilming initiative. The new versions contained standardized templates with less historical detail. Several were retyped entirely, omitting prior annotations. In 1974, Tanders submitted a final request for a diocesan review of St. Cecilia's staff logs. She cited multiple unresolved entries, including incomplete transfer sheets and absences from death registries. Her request was formally acknowledged, but categorized as non-essential. By then, the diocese was undergoing administrative restructuring, and historical audits were considered low priority. No further attempts to reconcile the missing entries were recorded. In 1977, a team of archivists tasked with updating the diocese's clerical census discovered inconsistencies between ordination records and retirement logs. While reconciling data from pre-1960 rosters, 2 entries linked to St. Cecilia Sanctuary lacked any subsequent ministry details. These omissions had not appeared significant in earlier audits due to manual filing limitations. With the adoption of tabular card systems, discrepancies became more apparent. The 2 clergy entries had valid ordination dates and were listed as active for 5 years before being reassigned to St. Cecilia. After the reassignment, no records followed. Retirement logs contained no pensions and diocesan publications did not report their departure. A margin note on one index card simply read, "No further info post-Cecilia." The census team referred the matter to the Chancery Office, which returned the cards with no comment. Despite the lack of follow-through, the gaps in records continued to resurface as more diocesan departments adopted structured archival formats. In 1979, a consultant reviewing pension histories flagged St. Cecilia as having the highest proportion of unresolved entries among all diocesan facilities, With more than 10 long-term assignments, his notes indicated a trend that had not been statistically represented before due to scattered data. Meanwhile, at the regional seminary, where some of St. Cecilia's documentation had been transferred in 1954, graduate theology students initiated a capstone project cataloguing historical seminary-affiliated properties. The group included Edward Milbury, a third-year student with a background in library science. He obtained permission to access restricted archival material for research purposes. Milbury's findings were methodical. He compiled a list of 27 clergy whose files listed St. Cecilia as their final known assignment. In many cases, the last documented act was a property maintenance note or a liturgical service log, followed by silence. Letters stopped appearing in correspondence folders, personal effects were never archived, and in several cases the standard retirement forms were never initiated. Milbury requested clarification from the diocesan secretary, framing the inquiry as an academic concern. He received a brief reply thanking him for his interest, but noting that prior record-keeping inconsistencies preclude further reconciliation. Undeterred, he continued assembling a timeline and marked each personnel entry with the exact date of final activity traceable to St. Cecilia. When arranged chronologically, the pattern revealed a notable regularity. Over 21 years, the average time between final traceable activity of each individual ranged from 8 to 11 months. The frequency remained steady, despite fluctuations in diocesan staffing elsewhere. Milbury presented this finding during an internal seminar, which drew polite interest, but no official comment. That same year, a property reappraisal in Franklin County required updated site photographs of the former sanctuary. A junior field officer noted that the structure had sustained noticeable degradation. Sections of the exterior siding were missing, and upper-level windows had been sealed with corrugated material. The building was not listed for historical preservation, and no active utility lines were visible. The report was filed with the county registrar and forwarded to the diocese per standard procedure. No response was recorded. The building remained uninhabited, and local residents had little awareness of its former role. By the early 1980s, its use had shifted again, this time for seasonal equipment storage by an agricultural supplier based out of Fulton Township. In 1982, a researcher from the Pennsylvania Historical Record Commission, Martha Wilgert, contacted the diocesan office seeking background on St. Cecilia for a statewide inventory of defunct religious institutions. Her inquiry focused on whether any building blueprints, architectural elevations, or founding charters still existed. She was informed that all site records had been transferred during the 1954 closure and that no building plans were retained. Wilgert found this response unusual, as most religious facilities from that period had at least one elevation or site schematic archived with the founding diocese. Her attempts to locate duplicates in county records were unsuccessful. No construction permits were on file, and no tax easements from the 1890s referenced the sanctuary by name. She eventually located a hand-drawn plot sketch in a discontinued insurance file from 1912. The diagram included building measurements, but lacked interior specifications. The sanctuary's footprint appeared irregular compared to standard parish plans of the era. The sketch was labeled only with the property boundary ID number and had no clergy signatures. Wilgert's findings circulated briefly among preservation societies, but were not adopted for any conservation proposals. By this point, the structure was no longer deemed architecturally viable. Weather exposure and deferred maintenance had reduced its eligibility for registration. In 1986, Milbury, then an adjunct professor at a regional college, revisited his earlier research. He attempted to locate living relatives of the clergy listed in his original file. His efforts were hindered by privacy restrictions and incomplete public records. In 2 cases, he reached out to extended family members who confirmed receiving letters from St. Cecilia, but stated that communication had stopped unexpectedly without explanation. One relative recalled that a suitcase of personal belongings was mailed to them in the early 1950s with no return address. The suitcase included devotional texts, stationery, and an unsigned notebook. No follow-up correspondence ever arrived. Milbury included this anecdote in a conference paper, though the source declined to be identified. His presentation, delivered at a local religious history symposium, focused on procedural silence in mid-century clerical record-keeping. While the paper avoided speculation, it emphasized the frequency and consistency of missing exit data from St. Cecilia. Several attendees from neighboring dioceses acknowledged similar challenges in rural personnel tracking, but did not comment publicly on Milbury's case study. By the end of the decade, diocesan priorities had shifted toward digitizing active clergy files. Historical audits were no longer supported. With limited staff and growing attention to contemporary administrative needs, past anomalies received little follow-up. The St. Cecilia file remained unamended. In 1991, a retired records assistant named Willard Hepner submitted a letter to the Diocesan Historical Committee. He had worked in filing operations during the mid-1950s and recalled processing unsorted envelopes labeled Cecilia Transfer Duplicates. According to Hepner, these documents were meant to be refiled, but were never incorporated into main directories. He believed the envelope had been misplaced during the transition to the York archive site. His letter included a simple request. If the envelope surfaced, could it be added to the permanent record? The committee acknowledged receipt, but did not locate the materials. Hepner's note was the last known correspondence on the matter. In 1993, the Diocesan Archives received a request from a Pennsylvania-based historical documentary initiative seeking access to institutional closure files. The request specifically mentioned St. Cecilia Sanctuary due to its length of operation and abrupt decommissioning. The archives director, Richard Dorr, approved access with standard restrictions. Over 3 months, the researchers reviewed scanned microfilm, property records, and personnel entries, noting inconsistencies previously dismissed as clerical oversights. Among the researchers was Lydia Enright, a former library systems analyst with experience in pattern detection. She compiled a set of frequency charts based on appearance and disappearance intervals of clergy names, cross-referencing internal directories with external publications. Enright's analysis reinforced the earlier conclusions of Edward Milbury, but went further by overlaying postal schedules, fuel delivery records, and visitor registries to determine periods of sustained isolation at St. Cecilia. Her findings revealed that during the majority of each year, no scheduled interactions occurred between the sanctuary and other diocesan entities. Fuel deliveries and parcel dispatches dropped to 0 in several months. Liturgical calendars were left blank in years when staffing logs still listed full rosters. Enright presented her findings to the research team in a summary entitled Administrative Voids and Archival Latency. The document noted a consistent failure of follow-up across departments. After the project concluded, Enright retained copies of selected materials with diocesan permission. Her notes included comments on the absence of personnel accountability protocols at institutions labeled as sanctuaries rather than active parishes. She also identified 3 entries where official diocesan correspondence was addressed to deceased clergy years after their recorded appointment at St. Cecilia. These letters were never returned. In 1995, a short article appeared in a regional history quarterly referencing the project's work. Though general in tone, it included a paragraph on St. Cecilia's closure, noting the lack of successor documentation. This paragraph attracted the attention of Charles Atworth, a retired administrative assistant from the bishop's office. Atworth had briefly visited St. Cecilia in 1949 for a courier delivery. He contacted the authors to clarify that during his visit, no permanent staff had introduced themselves. Instead, he was met by an individual who accepted the delivery without identifying his role. Atworth described the grounds as quiet and in partial disuse. The interior, though clean, showed signs of limited occupancy. He recalled unused guest rooms and an infirmary stocked but unmanned. According to his account, he was told by the recipient that records were between updates. He did not question the explanation at the time, but had never returned to the site. His statement was informally added to the archive's supplemental notes. By 1997, inquiries about defunct religious properties had increased, partly due to broader public interest in regional historical preservation. In this context, a graduate thesis from East Commonwealth University included a case study on St. Cecilia. The thesis, focused on procedural discontinuity in institutional closures, assembled comparative timelines between St. Cecilia and 4 other rural sanctuaries. The author, Daniel Royst, used diocesan bulletins, census records, and archived homily schedules to demonstrate that St. Cecilia had a disproportionately high number of unannotated terminations. He noted that none of the other sanctuaries in the study showed more than 4 consecutive years of missing data. St. Cecilia's record gaps spanned up to 11 years. Royst interviewed administrative retirees, including a former seminary director, who recalled hearing that St. Cecilia was self-staffed during its final years. The phrase suggested a model in which clergy were not rotated according to standard procedure, but remained indefinitely with minimal oversight. Royst cited this comment as indicative of administrative neglect rather than policy. Further complicating the issue was a 1965 memo found in the seminary archives regarding property valuations. The memo stated that St. Cecilia had not filed usage reports for over a decade before its closure. According to diocesan rules, such reports were mandatory for all operational sites. The absence of documentation would normally have triggered a compliance review. No such review was located. In early 1999, the York Diocesan Centre undertook a digitization project to transition paper records to electronic formats. During the sorting phase, a mislabeled box was opened containing typed index cards and carbon copies previously believed lost. Among them was the envelope described in Willard Hepner's 1991 letter. It was marked Cecilia Transfer Duplicates. The envelope contained photocopies of staff intake forms from 1941 to 1953, each bearing stamps from the Diocesan Personnel Office. Many included notations suggesting temporary appointments, although no duration was specified. Several cards listed expected departure dates, all of which passed without corresponding exit documentation. Most of the clergy listed did not reappear in any other diocesan directory after their appointment to St. Cecilia. A second envelope within the box, marked Rotations Pending, held unsigned memos recommending reassignment of clergy from St. Cecilia to various parishes in Philadelphia, Erie, and Scranton. None of the memos bore final approval signatures. Diocesan staff acknowledged receipt of the box, but determined that its contents, while unusual, did not warrant administrative reopening of historical files. By the early 2000s, St. Cecilia was mentioned primarily in footnotes or niche institutional histories. The building itself, though still standing, had been heavily modified by successive private owners. Interior walls had been removed, and the original chapel structure had been partially demolished to accommodate agricultural storage. Remaining stained glass windows were replaced with standard glazing. The last semi-official reference to the sanctuary came in a 2003 land review that listed the parcel as formerly religious, now agricultural. The review made no reference to its prior operational scope. It noted only that all religious affiliations had been expunged from zoning records as of 1972. In the years that followed, researchers continued to encounter fragments of documentation tied to St. Cecilia. A catalogue card found in a misfiled diocesan index in 2005 listed for Wallace Bear's last known location as Sancta Cecilia RM3, a designation not used elsewhere in diocesan geography. Inquiries into what RM3 signified yielded no results. Former staff suggested it may have been shorthand for a restricted module or residential map entry, though this was never confirmed. As the Diocesan Archive expanded its online presence, several missing entries from the 1930s through 1950s were quietly removed from publicly accessible directories. Internal documentation noted that certain personnel files had been deemed incomplete and were withheld pending verification. No timeline for verification was provided. In 2007, a local genealogist named Clarice Danton undertook a personal project to trace the clerical history of her great-uncle, Functor Peter Thoman, who had served in multiple parishes across south-central Pennsylvania in the 1930s and 1940s. Family records suggested his last appointment had been to a rural sanctuary, though no retirement or obituary documentation was ever found. Danton located a notation in a 1946 diocesan directory listing Tholman's name under St. Cecilia, marked with an asterisk and the phrase, "extended term." None of the family members were aware of this assignment. Letters from Tholman ceased around that same year. When Danton contacted the diocesan office, she was told the sanctuary's personnel files were no longer accessible to the public. She was provided only with a generic explanation that many rural clergy records had been lost or were incomplete due to administrative transitions in the mid-century period. Unwilling to leave the matter unresolved, Danton filed a Freedom of Information request for property correspondence between the diocese and Franklin County during the years 1945 to 1955. The documents she received included several invoices and delivery manifests addressed to St. Cecilia, but signed only with initials. One 1951 invoice included a notation requesting that all deliveries be made to the back entrance due to chapel floor reconstruction. No subsequent records of that construction exist in diocesan maintenance summaries. Further review revealed that Tholman was not the only member of the clergy assigned to St. Cecilia, whose name failed to appear in any of the regional burial indices. Danton uncovered 2 additional names with no matching cemetery entries, despite documented service years that implied they would have remained in Pennsylvania during retirement. Letters of inquiry to nearby diocesan cemeteries yielded no confirmations. Later that year, Danton connected with a librarian at a regional college who shared access to scanned microfilm of weekly parish bulletins. One bulletin from 1947 noted that a visiting speaker from St. Cecilia was expected at a charity luncheon. The name was unfamiliar to Danton and did not appear in the official clergy roster for that year. It was one of only 2 public mentions of a St. Cecilia staff member from the decade. The event's cancellation was announced the following week, with no reason given. In 2010, during the digitization of early cemetery ledgers, a volunteer from the Historical Commission of Franklin County found an entry under the name P.T. with no listed surname or date of birth. The burial was dated August 1948 and recorded only as a plot in a restricted section adjacent to a discontinued chapel site. While there was no definitive link to Tholman, the initials and date aligned with his last known communication. The commission submitted the entry for annotation, though no identifying documentation surfaced. By 2012, public access to diocesan personnel records had been curtailed further as part of an institutional effort to streamline historical inquiries. Researchers were required to submit specific evidence of familial connection or academic credentials. As a result, casual inquiries into defunct facilities like St. Cecilia became increasingly rare. In 2014, however, a former surveyor named Gerald Arwin gave a public talk at the Franklin County History Guild, describing an inspection he had performed in 1975 of the St. Cecilia property, then under agricultural lease. Arwin mentioned discovering a sealed room beneath what had once been the main hall. The room, accessible only through a subfloor hatch, had been empty, but bore signs of prior use, including wooden shelving and a tiled basin. Arwin stated that he had reported the feature to the leasing agent, who dismissed it as an abandoned root cellar. The details were never documented in county surveys. His recollection prompted a follow-up visit by local historians, though by then the hatch had been removed and the area repurposed for equipment housing. That same year, an intern at the York Diocesan Archive found a reference card labeled Cecilia, Third Wing Access. The card, dated 1952, listed names of internal contacts and noted that the wing was not to be entered without clerical supervision. No corresponding architectural diagram was attached, and the wing was never mentioned in diocesan property inventories. When the intern inquired, the archive director explained that many older facilities used provisional naming for wing access and that the label likely referred to a now demolished hallway. In 2017, a private researcher compiling a database of Pennsylvania clergy lineage published a dataset that included 31 names affiliated with St. Cecilia. The dataset, drawn from appointment logs, ordination directories, and surviving chapel rosters, indicated that at least 27 of those names had no recorded return or reassignment post-placement. This information was not widely circulated, but became the basis for a limited print monograph titled Institutional Drift in Mid-Century Religious Networks. The monograph received modest attention from regional academic circles. Its central assertion was that administrative oversight at minor sanctuaries had created long-term gaps in clerical accountability, compounded by poor interdepartmental communication and localized record loss. It did not speculate on individual fates or propose conclusions beyond procedural breakdown. In 2019, a final attempt was made to recover personnel files during a scheduled closure of an off-site diocesan storage unit. The unit, containing pre-1970 appointment ledgers and audit reports, was being decommissioned and its contents re-evaluated. Volunteers discovered several bound volumes of handwritten notes that included scheduling rotations, fuel supply orders, and interior room designations for St. Cecilia. The room listings did not match any known blueprint. Designations included clerical rest, private ledger, and upper catalogue, none of which appeared in existing architectural records. Some entries were marked with initials rather than names. No annotations confirmed occupancy. The volumes were preserved, but not integrated into the main archive. As of 2020, the Diocesan Online Record Index listed St. Cecilia Sanctuary as closed, with a note that personnel records were archived separately. No guidance was offered for accessing them. The property remains privately owned, and the original building continues to be modified for non-residential use. The clerical names most closely associated with St. Cecilia have not been reinstated in diocesan memorial lists. Yearbooks omit any mention of reassignment or laicization. Public references are limited to brief notations in property logs and occasional footnotes in internal histories. The sanctuary's personnel history remains structurally intact only through surviving fragments, never officially reconciled. In 2021, a regional academic symposium in Mechanicsburg featured a panel on undocumented administrative outcomes in religious history. Among the speakers was Dr. Leonard Weiss, a specialist in archival process loss within ecclesiastical institutions. His presentation included a segment on St. Cecilia Sanctuary, which he used to illustrate the concept of residual clericalization, the long-term persistence of names in active directories, despite the absence of confirmable activity or departure. Weiss's presentation cited data compiled by independent researchers, including the cluster of missing reassignment records spanning 2 decades. He described the sanctuary's operational silence not as an anomaly but as a structural feature of its designation as an administrative holding post. His analysis did not seek to assign motive, but focused on how systems permitted informational decay in the absence of active auditing. Following the presentation, several attendees from diocesan historical offices engaged in informal discussion about whether similar retention voids had occurred at other facilities. Anecdotal accounts were exchanged, mostly involving overseas seminaries or foreign missionary houses. St. Cecilia was the only domestic sanctuary mentioned in which over 24 personnel appointments lacked verifiable closure. The event did not result in new policies or investigations. However, the symposium's published proceedings later attracted the attention of a non-profit group dedicated to clerical record transparency. They filed a request to the Pennsylvania Office of Religious Charters seeking clarification on St. Cecilia's legal status at the time of closure. The office replied that the sanctuary had held a provisional charter until 1953, after which no renewal was filed. No inquiry was made into the reason for its expiration. That same year, an independent online registry cataloging former Pennsylvania religious institutions added an entry for St. Cecilia. The listing included location, year of foundation, and operational period, along with the note, "No successor institution." This designation was applied only to facilities whose functions had not been transferred or absorbed. Among over 300 entries, only 6 carried this label. By 2022, awareness of the sanctuary's irregular closure reached a new generation of archivists and digital historians. A graduate research initiative at a Philadelphia university assembled a working group to catalog clerical postings with unresolved terminal dates. Their dataset, based on public and restricted records, listed St. Cecilia as having the highest number of such entries. The research was methodical, avoiding any claims beyond administrative structure. Its publication in an academic journal focused on ecclesiastical history drew cautious responses from diocesan leadership. A formal statement acknowledged gaps in mid-century record maintenance and reaffirmed commitment to archival integrity. It did not address specific names or institutions. While the data itself was not controversial, the pattern it revealed prompted limited reviews at other diocesan archives. None reported matching the scale of St. Cecilia's personnel's silence. Several offices referenced isolated cases of missing retirement forms or unsigned transfer sheets, but stated that such cases were typically resolved through reconciliation with parish bulletins or cemetery registers. St. Cecilia, by contrast, offered no such cross-reference points. The sanctuary's lack of parishioner engagement, public-facing ministry, or consistent participation in diocesan events left it largely isolated from collateral documentation. As a result, most attempts to trace personnel activity beyond appointment dates ended in blank spaces. In late 2022, a former administrative courier contacted the Diocesan Historical Committee after reading the journal article. He stated that he had delivered parcels to St. Cecilia between 1950 and 1953 on at least 6 occasions. According to his account, the sanctuary always received deliveries at a rear entrance, where a staff member, never the same individual twice, signed for the items. No conversations occurred beyond basic acknowledgements. He described the grounds as maintained but not active, with few signs of occupancy outside the main building. He recalled no external signage and noted that the surrounding land had already begun transitioning to pasture. His account was consistent with the visual assessments recorded by county surveyors from the same period. The committee added his statement to their supplemental archive, but did not reopen the sanctuary file. Standard policy discouraged retroactive reviews unless legal or administrative necessity was demonstrated. The sanctuary's personnel file remained unindexed in the digital system. Meanwhile, a retired seminarian living in Altoona submitted a letter to the regional journal that had published the 2021 proceedings. He had visited St. Cecilia once in 1952 during a brief assignment to deliver liturgical supplies. His letter described an environment of quiet reclusiveness, where assigned clergy did not wear formal vestments, and conversations were limited to logistical matters. He had stayed only 2 days. The letter included an observation that the sanctuary's chapel appeared partially disused, with some pews moved aside, and storage boxes placed near the altar rail. He assumed it was undergoing maintenance. He did not recall seeing any active preparation for public services. This correspondence was preserved in the journal's reader submissions file, but was not published due to length constraints. The editorial board noted that while the letter added anecdotal value, it did not introduce new documentation. As of 2023, the property remains zoned for mixed agricultural and limited historical survey access. The building's original foundation has been largely obscured by retrofitted walls and insulation. Interior inspection is restricted to owners and their designees. No efforts have been made to restore or designate the structure for public interpretation. Several of the names once associated with St. Cecilia have since been entered into genealogical indexes through family submissions. These entries typically rely on baptismal or ordination records with no mention of terminal assignments. In absence of obituary notices, family historians have relied on personal correspondence or oral accounts. The diocesan yearbook now lists St. Cecilia among discontinued rural operations. The entry includes only founding and closure dates, with no staffing data. Inquiries directed to the archive regarding the sanctuary are answered with a prepared summary, stating that its records are incomplete and not presently available for public access. In early 2024, a group of graduate students from a central Pennsylvania university initiated a collaborative digital humanities project focused on cross-referencing unmarked clergy departures from diocesan service records between 1930 and 1960. The team developed a keyword-matching script capable of identifying missing transitions based on ordination logs, annual bulletins, cemetery entries, and appointment notices. Among over 200 institutions surveyed, St. Cecilia Sanctuary returned the highest incidence of unclosed entries. The findings were presented at a spring colloquium and received moderate attention in regional academic circles. Although the project did not speculate on cause or motive, its documentation added structure to the previously anecdotal gaps associated with the sanctuary. A parallel working group began constructing a public-facing timeline of the institution's official interactions, based solely on dated correspondence invoices and diocesan ledger references. What emerged was a chronology of quiet administrative erasure. The sanctuary's presence in formal channels gradually diminished between 1945 and 1953, with no announcements, no complaints, and no visible administrative interventions. Each year, fewer communications arrived, fewer names appeared, and fewer adjustments were made to reflect changes in occupancy. In mid-2024, an independent historical surveyor named Julian Ray obtained permission to conduct a non-invasive ground analysis of the sanctuary's former grounds using publicly available maps and remote imaging tools. His aim was to overlay existing property data with archived site descriptions and produce a diagram for academic reference. Reg's final composite model revealed inconsistencies between current building measurements and earlier plot layouts. A small extension on the west side of the structure did not appear in the original insurance sketches from the early 20th century. County development maps from the 1960s listed the addition as a tool bay, but no construction approval or modification request had been filed with zoning authorities. Inquiries to the present owners confirmed that the space had existed at the time of their acquisition and had been repurposed as a seed storage unit. No original features remained. Ray's findings were submitted to a local architectural journal and archived for reference. He did not pursue further investigation. Meanwhile, two of the project's researchers submitted follow-up queries to diocesan administrators regarding the sanctuary's personnel recovery process. The responses reiterated prior statements that files from St. Cecilia were incomplete and could not be independently verified. The responses did not include references to the rediscovered transfer duplicate folder or other archival anomalies. When asked whether internal audits had ever been conducted to account for the missing personnel outcomes, the diocese responded that no such review had been deemed necessary given the age of the records and lack of formal grievance. Without documented requests from next of kin or official diocesan errors on record, retroactive reconciliation was not prioritized. In the absence of institutional revision, a number of private researchers began compiling their own index of names, dates, and last known postings. The index was crowdsourced using data from liturgical bulletins, seminary rosters, and regional newspaper mentions. Each entry included a digital citation trail, date of final appointment, and whether any departure was confirmed. By late 2024, the list included 27 clergy associated with St. Cecilia, whose records did not reflect reassignment, retirement, or death within diocesan documentation. In each case, the final entry was an appointment to the sanctuary. The index was submitted to the Pennsylvania Historical Preservation Office for cataloging and was granted an informal review designation under institutional disappearance categories. No legislative action followed. The index was preserved online and linked from several university archival resource pages, but did not trigger further diocesan correspondence. The sanctuary itself remained referenced only in property tax ledgers, which listed it as an altered-use private structure with no historical designation. In late November, a retired maintenance contractor from the Diocesan Facilities Division contacted a researcher affiliated with the digital project. He recounted visiting St. Cecilia in 1953 to inspect roof damage following a late-season storm. According to his account, the building appeared underused, with furnishings covered and no visible activity in the residential wing. He recalled being told by an individual on site that the sanctuary was not in general service. The visitor did not record the inspection formally, stating that the diocese had stopped filing routine maintenance logs for the sanctuary during its final years. His account was added to the project's oral history collection, but was not forwarded to the diocesan archives, which had ceased accepting unsolicited testimonial entries after 2018. In January 2025, a final inventory of rural sanctuary properties was conducted by a state-funded preservation agency. The report categorized St. Cecilia as structurally extant but functionally repurposed. It did not qualify for conservation funding due to its extensive modification and absence of architectural distinctiveness. The report did, however, include a footnote acknowledging the unresolved personnel record gaps associated with the site. The footnote stated that while no official cause for the record lapses had been established, multiple academic sources had documented the administrative inconsistencies. It cited the 2021 Academic Journal, the 2022 Clerical Review Initiative, and the 2024 Digital Index. The note concluded that the matter was historically notable but administratively closed. Today, the building that once served as St. Cecilia Sanctuary stands as an unmarked structure along a private road, surrounded by open fields and used seasonally for agricultural storage. The original chapel wing has been removed. No signage indicates the property's past, and no formal site visitation is permitted. Among diocesan references, the sanctuary is listed only within inactive facility logs. No annual acknowledgements are made. The names once associated with the site remain excluded from published rosters and memorial registries. Their files, fragmented across outdated ledgers and incomplete appointment cards, continue to circulate through private efforts, but have not been formally reconciled. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story is fictional. All names have been edited to protect the source. This video is for entertainment purposes only. But here's a disclaimer. It's based on historical facts.